We'll now listen to the words of exhortation through Brother Jonathan to the theme of stretch forth your arm.
Well, good morning, my dear brothers and sisters, and thank you very much for coming once more to listen to my words as we come to remember the life, death, and resurrection of our Lord. And you know, what a life it was. We are blessed in having his word before us, in that we are able to open its pages and see snapshots, pictures of his life. And the reading that was done by Brother Brad this morning does open up just a small picture in his life. He entered again into the synagogue at Mark 3 verse 1. And there was a man there which had a withered hand. And they watched him whether he would heal on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse him. You see, he had come once more into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. And what was the Sabbath day? What was the purpose of the Sabbath? You could ask the Pharisees, and they would tell you that it was a day of rest, a day where you would be doing no labor. The true purpose of the Sabbath had been forgotten. Yes, it was a day of rest, but it was also a day to rejoice in the Lord. The Sabbath day was meant to be a rest from works, a rest from sin. Now, on this occasion, there had recently been a succession of Sabbath days that the Lord had come into conflict with the religious leaders of the time regarding working on the Sabbath day. So keep your hand in Mark, but we're going to have a look at some of the other gospel records of what was happening during this time. First of all, turn to John, chapter 5. And verse 8. Jesus saith unto him, Rise, take up thy bed, and walk. And immediately the man was made whole, and took up his bed, and walked. And on the same day was the Sabbath. The Jews therefore said unto him that was cured, It is the Sabbath day. It is not lawful for thee to carry thy bed. And then when we come to Luke, chapter 6, beginning at verse 1. And it came to pass, on the second Sabbath, after the first, that he went through the cornfields, and his disciples plucked the ears of corn and did eat, rubbing them in their hands. And certain of the Pharisees said unto them, Why do ye that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath days? Now, the beauty of the Bible is that there is never a word that is used in the Bible that is not actually meant to be used. So here, the second Sabbath after the first. This is just a week away from when they had last condemned him from when he healed the man at Bethesda. And the record of the man with the withered hand is also expressed in Luke chapter 6 and verse 6. It came to pass also on another Sabbath that he entered into the synagogue and taught. And there was a man whose right hand was withered. Now, I can't prove it, but it does seem very likely that this event happened the very week after the disciples plucked corn in the cornfields. And that is actually further supported when you go back to the Mark record. In Mark chapter 2, if you've been keeping up with our daily readings. The event where the disciples were moving through the cornfields, plucking the ears of corn, is also recorded in Mark chapter 2, beginning at verse 23. It came to pass that when he went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day, and his disciples began as they went to pluck the ears of corn. And the Pharisees said unto him, Behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful? And he said unto them, Have ye never read what David did when he had need and was an hungered, he and they that were with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and did eat the showbread, which is not lawful to eat but for the priests, and gave also to them that which were with him. And he said unto them, The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. And that final statement, the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath, would have cut them like a knife. And in the very next verse, Mark chapter 3, verse 1, he entered again into the synagogue. So we have a succession of Sabbath days, days of rest, where the Lord came into the conflict with the religious leaders over the Sabbath, over the purpose of the Sabbath. Now, as we've said, the purpose of the Sabbath day was that we rest from sin, not just labor. The Jews had taken it to the nth degree, where rather than doing anything on the Sabbath day, they would be sitting around and doing nothing, which is not really getting the point. They were not meant to be sitting around doing nothing or planning for the next day and the next week. The Sabbath was meant to be a day to rejoice, to worship God. And they were certainly not meant to use the Sabbath as a means to try and trap others. Look closer at Mark chapter 3. He entered again into the synagogue, and there was a man there which had a withered hand. And they, the Pharisees, watched him, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse him. This man with the withered hand was not there by accident. He was there by the planning of the Pharisees. See how they watched him whether he would heal him on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse him. But you know, it is interesting that the man that they had used in this occasion had a withered hand. This man was not born that way. His hand was an injury of sorts, or some sort of disease. At least that's what the language points to. The Greek word for withered here is zeiraino, to desiccate, to be shriveled up, to become dried up. And the word withered is actually used in several occasions. For instance, the fig tree that bore no fruit. See how the tree is withered. It was not something which was a congenital disease from birth. It was something that had happened. And you remember from Luke chapter 6, verse 6, we find record that it was the man's right hand that was withered. Now, despite both my father and my little brother being left-handed, the right hand is what we normally associate with labor, with work, with production. And this hand, being dried up, is no longer able to labor. It is no longer able to serve. So Here you have a man who has lost his capacity to work, his capacity to serve. And by the end of this event, it is restored to him. And that's a theme that you can see going throughout this small section of the scriptures. So come to Matthew chapter 20. And let's begin at verse 25. But Jesus called them unto him, and said, Ye know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. But it shall not be so among you. But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. Can you understand what Christ is saying here as he's speaking to his disciples? Now, you know the way of the Gentile, that they love to be served, but that will not be the same manner amongst you. The ones who should be great among you, let him be the minister. The ones who will be chief among you, let him be your servant. Can you see how this message is actually hidden behind the text in Mark chapter 3? You had here the rulers of the Jews, the Pharisees, who were trying to catch out Christ that they might slay him. These Pharisees were known to love the praise of men. They would go through and pray on the corners where they'd be able to be seen, where they'd be able to be served by those around them. And here you have a man with a withered hand who on the Sabbath day, when they could do nothing, no work, no labor, no service, and yet here he was being given the capacity to serve and work once again. And it was happening in the very best place for it, in the synagogue, in the temple, on the Sabbath. He is being restored to life and health. So, back to verse 1. In Mark chapter 3, you can see that he entered again into the synagogue. The word again here indicates that he was still in Capernaum, as we saw from yesterday's Bible reading, Mark chapter 2, verse 1. And again he entered into Capernaum after some days, and it was noised that he was in the house. So, as we said, the last week when he was in the grain field, the week before that, he was in Peter's house when the lame man came down through the roof. Another reason why I think that this man with the withered hand was deliberately set before Christ is due to the way that Christ finished his conversation with the Pharisees in the last chapter. The Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. Now, can you feel how that statement would have burned up the Pharisees? This was a setup. The Pharisees were hoping to catch him in some sort of crime, one that they could prove conclusively. And they had already laid so many accusations against him. In Mark chapter 2, they had styled him as a blasphemer, forgiving sins when he forgave sins. Mark 2 verse 7. Why did this man thus speak blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God only? They described him as a colleague of sinners in Mark 2 verse 16, when he had called Levi. And when the scribes and Pharisees saw him eat with publicans and sinners, they said unto his disciples, How is it that he eateth and drinketh with publicans and sinners? They described him as one who had disregarded religious discipline by ignoring fasting in Mark 2, verse 18. The disciples of John and of the Pharisees used to fast, and they came and said unto him, Why do the disciples of John and of the Pharisees fast, but thy disciples fast not? And they had accused him as a violator of Sabbath rules in Mark 2, verse 24. Well, wasn't this enough? The fact that he had violated the Sabbath was something which was punishable. That was, in their eyes, a crime. Well, actually, no, it wasn't. If we come back to Luke chapter 6, verse 2. After the disciples had plucked the corn, it says that certain of the Pharisees said unto him, Why do ye that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath days? You see, amongst the Jews, picking grains of corn was not something that was considered a definitive crime even on the Sabbath. Gleaning was permitted under the law, and not all of the Pharisees would agree that it would not be permitted on the Sabbath. That's why you have the language used here. And certain of the Pharisees said unto him, not all, just probably most. Hence the setup. There could be no debate. They needed to catch him red-handed. And so they had the man with the withered hand. The withered right hand. As I've mentioned before, the right hand was considered to be the workman's hand, and this affliction was not a disease that he was born with. And when you have a close look at the Talmud, they actually have a criteria as to what can actually be healed on the Sabbath day. What it boils down to is that if you can survive, if it's not an emergency, then it can wait. So, you see, if you're likely to die, then you could actually do work to try and heal them. But if you had a broken bone, and this is one of the specifics that's actually mentioned, if you had a broken bone, it could not actually be set on the Sabbath day because that was work. It wasn't something which needed to be done immediately, so it could wait until the next day. A withered hand was not a disease that he had been born with. It was obviously not an emergency. It was something which the man had lived with for a long period of time. And so, under the law, if somebody worked to heal that, well, then they would have him. So, in Mark chapter 3 and verse 2, and they watched him, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse him. And they were watching him closely. And as time went on, they kept watching him. Jesus here was under a critical examination, very critical examination. They were trying to find something that they could pin against him. And can you picture it? Jesus is standing there in the synagogue, probably teaching. There's disciples around him. There's people who are listening. And in the back, you've got the rulers, arms crossed, just staring, daring him to do something, waiting so that they can catch him out. The entire situation is a trial, with the Pharisees as the accusers just waiting for, in their eyes, a mistake to be made. But, it's actually funny because throughout history, since his coming, there has never been a generation when Jesus has not been critically examined. Always there have been people trying to prove him wrong, trying to find a flaw. There has not been a single person in history who has been more meticulously examined. And this examination of Christ will continue until the end of time. Though it's strange, though, how when people examine Christ, they also examine us. How often do you end up thinking, well, no, I can't do that because a Christadelphian wouldn't do that. A brother of Christ would not do that. Do you ever, or have you ever had the experience where you had someone say, oh, I wouldn't think that a Christadelphian would be like that. When you are put next to Christ and used as a yardstick to measure Christ, how much responsibility do we have in that moment? In here, this case, the Pharisees were looking for Jesus to do work. In their own minds, he had provoked them when he said that he was the Lord of the Sabbath. Remember, in their own minds, Jesus might as well have claimed that he was a deity by saying something like that. They can't see the truth of it, and so they will do whatever they can to prove it to be a lie. And so they solicited the services of this man with the withered hand, probably plonked him right in the front row where he's visible to all, including Jesus. And now there they stand, watching, hoping that he will take the bait so that they can accuse him. And like I said, if he did, there would be no room for debate, like when the disciples plucked the corn from the cornfields, which not everyone would agree was unlawful to do so. Now, look at verse 3. And he saith unto the man which had the withered hand, stand forth. Step forward. This is one of the only times in the gospel records where Jesus does not wait for someone to ask for him to heal. The leper, if you're willing, the blind man, Son of David, have mercy on me. Have mercy on me, Lord, that I might receive my sight. Instead, rather than waiting for the request, Jesus calls forth this person, stand forth. And he would have brought him right in the middle where everyone could see him. And, it's a wrong thing to do, but have you noticed that when a lot of people, when we have a disabled person in the room, we tend to politely just avert our eyes. You don't notice him as much. Not in this case. In this case, he was brought in the very middle of the room. Stand forth. He was there to be seen. And again, can you see how unusual this is? Normally, when Jesus heals someone, he takes them aside. He tries to keep it a quiet affair. He sends people out of the room. The maid is not dead, but sleepeth. Sends him out of the room and raises her. He asks that they do not spread word of him healing them. Not so here. He makes this man stand right in the middle of the room where every eye in the room is fixed on that man. And can you imagine the tension that would have actually just ratcheted up? It would become so thick that you could cut it with a knife. The Pharisees, they're leaning forward, they're waiting, they've got him. He's going to make that mistake. They're going to be able to accuse him. And then he turns. And no longer are they looking at him. Jesus is now looking at them. Verse 4. He saith unto them, Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath days, or to do evil? To save life, or to kill? But they held their peace. Now, that question seems almost strange, doesn't it? You know, in psychology, you learn of something called guided questioning, where your questions are designed to lead a person to a conclusion, where you restrict the number of answers rather than allowing a person to find their own option, a third option. This question, though, his question here acts to unmask the intentions of his accusers. Jesus has now put himself in the position of the accuser. Is it lawful? And the Pharisees, they were all about the law. So what is lawful? Laws are a question that can occupy our minds with things like limits, things like boundaries. It brings to mind drawing a line, what is right and what is not. So, where do you draw the line? Do you ever find yourself thinking, well, I haven't actually crossed that line? Not yet. Do you find yourselves asking that question, where exactly should I draw the line? And that can be in any situation that you come in throughout your life. And brothers and sisters, that is a very dangerous way of thinking. When you start coming at a situation and you think to yourself, well, where do I draw the line? By having this thought, you are already acknowledging that a line must be drawn, that this situation is not God edifying. So in reality, you're asking yourself some very different questions. You're asking yourself, well, where do I draw the line? How far can I go? You're asking yourself, how close to sin can I actually get before, it's a black mark against my record? Because you want to get just barely to that line, but you don't want to put a toe over it. That's so very highly destructive when it comes to living a life that is acceptable unto God, because it puts all of our focus onto the wrong things. And the thing is that is exactly what the Pharisees were like. They lived their lives day in and day out in a meticulous, deliberate way to draw lines. Oh, and even when they were coming to accuse Jesus, you can see the evidence of it, because not all of them had the line at the same place. No, the line's over here. Well, actually, I'd say it's over here. No. I disagree with you both. The line's over here. Well, he picked corn on the Sabbath. That's the line that's been crossed. Well, actually, no, that's not really the line that can be crossed. There's a little bit of leeway there. And what does Jesus do in this situation? Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath day or to do evil? He renders that thought process down to its absolute conclusion. What is lawful? Good or evil? Give life or take life? And the line then becomes very, very definite. And make no mistake, that is exactly what it is. It's just now that, well, we've taken away some of the pretty decoration around it to see it in black and white. Jesus puts it in the highest possible contrast. And he does this so that he can highlight something that which becomes an integral part of the doctrine. What is lawful to do? And yet, we are no longer under the law. We are under grace. And the New Testament repeats this many, many times, especially Paul. We are not under the law, we are under grace. And that legal mindset to follow the law, that propensity for the Pharisees, who make no mistake, had a very legal mindset. They followed the law, after all, is not a mindset which we ourselves should ascribe to do. The questions that we should be asking ourselves, being under grace, should be very, very different. A mind that is inspired by grace should not be asking, well, okay, how close to sin can I actually get and still be safe? It should instead be asking, what is the good that I can accomplish here? Is there a limit to the amount of good that I can do here? Have you ever asked yourself, how can I be as pure and wholesome and healthy and righteous in my pursuit of a relationship with God to build a foundation in the truth that will last not just a lifetime but an eternity? That's the right question to ask. Not how close to sin can I get, not how close to death can I get, but how close to life can I get? It's a very, very different question, isn't it? Grace goes in a different direction than law. What were the fruits of the Spirit? What are the fruits of the Spirit? The fruits are love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, lastly, temperance. And how does it finish? Against such there is no law. Galatians 5, verse 22 to 23. So there is no law against how loving you can be. Can you imagine if there was? God so loved the world that he gave for us his only begotten Son. Oh, I'm sorry, but we can't accept that because you're just too loving. What was the greatest commandment? Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy might, and with all thy soul. And the second is like unto it, love thy neighbor as thyself. Love thy neighbor. Do good to your neighbor, and by doing so, you will fulfill all the requirements of the law. So, which is lawful? To do good or do evil? That's a very different way to look at life than drawing your lines and living in restrictions. And that's why in this remarkable moment with the man with the withered hand, Jesus is acting to transform the Sabbath from a day of holy lethargy, holy paralysis, to a day of holy action, a day to do good, to do a different class of activity. And make no mistake, we should be looking for opportunities to do good. James 5, verse 17. Therefore, to him that knoweth to do good, and doeth it not, to him it is sin. When you know that it is the right thing to do good, and you see the opportunity to do good, and you don't do it, that is counted as sin. So in this situation, Jesus sets the question before the Pharisees. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? Here he is referring to the man in front of him, who he had called to the center of the crowd, and to whom he was about to do good. Or is it lawful to do evil? And this points directly at the Pharisees, who are literally doing evil, plotting his destruction on the Sabbath, even as they are sitting there in the synagogue. Which is lawful? Doing what I'm doing or doing what you're doing? To save life or to kill? But they kept silent? I mean, the answer is obvious, is it not? And the only way that they could possibly respond to something like this is with repentance. And there was no way that they were willing to do something like that. And so in verse 5, when he had looked round about on them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their heart, he looked around. The situation started with them all looking at him, trying to find some sort of flaw that they could use to accuse him. And now he is looking at them. He looked around. And I'm certain as he looked, he would have looked every single one of them in the face. And I don't think that a single one of them would have been able to hold his gaze. He was angry with them. And he was right to be angry. And yet, he was also grieved by the hardness of their heart. He was filled with a righteous indignation. What makes you angry? What riles you up? Is it anger at the world? When we look around and we see the hardness of people's hearts, when they refuse to accept God and when they refuse to accept all the signs and wonders which are around us? Or is your anger provoked because someone cut you off in traffic? Jesus was angry and grieved at the hardness of their heart. And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and it was made whole. He stretched it out. The healing took place as the man stretched out his hand. Sometimes when Jesus healed, he laid his hands on them. He placed clay over them, over their eyes. There are a multitude of different ways, but here it is the man who does all the work. He simply obeyed and acted in obedience to Jesus, and he was liberated to service. His right hand, his laboring hand, was restored by Jesus on that day of rest. Verse 6, and the Pharisees went forth, and straightway took counsel with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him. Do you know what the word conspiracy means? The dictionary definition of conspiracy is a combination of persons for an evil or unlawful purpose, an agreement between two or more persons to do something criminal, illegal, or reprehensible, especially in relation to treason, sedition, or murder, a plot. These men, these religious leaders of the time, engaged in conspiracy to commit a crime on the Sabbath. What is lawful to do on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill? They were acting in precise fulfillment of what Jesus had just asked them. But the man with the withered hand had been healed. He was able to work and to serve once more. His life had been saved. Why? Because he was commanded to stretch forth his hand. Can you see him there, in the middle of the synagogue, with Jesus in front of him, commanding him to stretch forth his hand? And he did. And when he did, he would have stretched forth his hand towards Christ, reaching towards him. And in doing so, he was saved. And we need to do the same, brothers and sisters. Like this man was unable to grasp hold of anything before he stretched forth his hand to Christ. We are ourselves unable to grasp salvation, not by ourselves. But if we stretch forth our hands towards Christ, then he will be there to help, to do good, to give life. Brothers and sisters, that is why we come this day to this memorial table. our Lord God stretched forth an open hand and sent forth his Son to the earth to bruise the head of the snake, to fulfill all the promises that have been foretold, and to become an intercessor for us to God, that we may have the chance at eternal life. Can you hear him? Stretch forth your hand. Take my hand. It is our decision, our choice to stretch forth a hand or not. Like it was Peter's choice when he saw Christ walking on the water to get out of the boat and to walk towards him. And yes, if we make that choice, the seas will be rough and the winds will be boisterous. The walk towards him will not be easy. But when Peter was afraid and he started to sink, what did he do? Lord, save me! And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him. He has made a way for us to be saved from death, to be given life everlasting. So don't just decide where to draw the line. Remember that we are not under the law but under grace. God's hand is not closed to us but open, with the greatest gift that there is imaginable there for us. And if you make the decision to stretch forth your hand to do good, to stretch out your hand to Christ, well, there will be no law as to how joyful you can be when on the day of our Lord's return, he takes your hand in fellowship.